The dawn broke red over the waters of Port Royal in the year 1689, and the men who saw it from the deck of the Crimson Judas whispered that blood would spill before the sun set again. Captain Matthias Rourke stood at the quarterdeck rail, his weathered hands gripping the wood until his knuckles whitened, his coat the color of dried rust that had earned him the name men spoke in fear and hatred, the Red Captain. He had ruled these waters for 7 years with a cruelty so absolute that Spanish merchantmen surrendered at the sight of his tattered crimson ensign, and even the buccaneers of Tortuga crossed themselves when his name was mentioned in the rum-soaked taverns along the Hispaniola coast. The Crimson Judas was a 30-gun brigantine taken from a Dutch slaver off the Windward Passage, and her holds had grown fat with Spanish silver, Portuguese gold, and the plundered wealth of a dozen colonial towns from Cartagena to Santo Domingo. If you hunger for tales of the sea's darkest days, leave your mark below and tell us where you watch from. The crew of 140 souls had learned to obey without question, or face the cat-o'-nine-tails, the iron shackles in the hold, or worse, a slow death marooned on some nameless quay, with nothing but a pistol, a single ball, and a flask of rum to decide one's fate. Rourke had put 3 men ashore in such fashion during the past year alone, their crimes ranging from theft of an extra ration to muttering complaint within his hearing. The Red Captain believed that fear was the only currency that held value among thieves, and he spent it liberally. His face bore the scars of a dozen battles, a slash across his left cheek from a Spanish officer's sword at Maracaibo, a puckered burn on his neck from a powder explosion during the sacking of Portobello, and an empty socket where his right eye had been before a musket ball took it at the Battle of the Capes. He wore no patch. The hollow darkness served as reminder enough. The ship's articles, signed in blood by every man who took the Crimson Oath, gave Rourke powers that exceeded even those granted to Royal Navy captains. He alone decided when to strike, which vessels to pursue, how plunder would be divided, and what punishment would fall upon those who displeased him. The traditional pirate code that governed ships like those commanded by Henry Morgan or the French corsairs of Martinique held no sway aboard the Crimson Judas. There was no vote among the crew, no democratic council, no appeal to reason or mercy. There was only Rourke's will, enforced by his inner circle of 6 lieutenants who had followed him since his privateering days during the Anglo-Dutch conflicts, and who shared in his brutal philosophy. Among the crew, however, resentment had begun to grow like rot in timber. The men whispered in the darkness of the lower decks, while the tropical night pressed against the hull and the Caribbean swells rocked them in restless sleep. They spoke of the treasure they had helped seize but rarely enjoyed, for Rourke kept the greater shares for himself and his favourites, distributing only enough to the common sailors to prevent open rebellion. They spoke of comrades who had died not in battle but under the lash or from infected wounds after Rourke had ordered them beaten for imagined slights. They spoke of the French buccaneer Jean Beaumont, who commanded a ship where every man received equal shares and where the captain could be deposed by vote if he proved unworthy. Such talk was sedition, and if discovered, would earn a man the noose at the yardarm. But desperation breeds courage even in the fearful. The boatswain, a thick-necked Welshman named Gareth Price, had survived 3 years under Rourke's command, longer than most, and had earned a measure of respect among the crew for his competence with sail and rigging. Price had been a merchant sailor before hard times drove him to piracy, and he remembered what it meant to serve under officers who valued their men's lives at least enough to keep them functional. He watched the Red Captain pace the quarterdeck each morning and evening, always vigilant, always suspicious, and Price understood that such a man would never change, never soften, never grant mercy where none had been shown before. The only question was how long the crew would endure before the breaking point arrived. That breaking point came closer in late September when the Crimson Judas intercepted a Spanish merchant galleon. the Santa Teresa, sailing north from Cartagena with a hold full of silver ingots bound for Havana. The chase lasted 4 hours across the turquoise waters south of Jamaica, the Spanish ship's crew frantically attempting to reach the protection of the fortified harbor at Port Royal, where English warships might intervene. But the brigantine was faster, and when the Crimson Judas came alongside and unleashed a devastating broadside of chain shot that shredded the galleon's rigging and brought down her mainmast in a crash of splintering wood and screaming men, the Spanish captain struck his colors. The boarding was swift and vicious, though the Spanish crew offered little resistance once their officers lay dead or wounded. The plunder exceeded even the most optimistic estimates: 40,000 pieces of 8 in silver bars, casks of wine and brandy from Jerez, bolts of silk intended for the governor's wife, and locked chests containing jeweled crucifixes and gold chains meant for the cathedral in Havana. The crew of the Crimson Judas loaded their prize with greedy haste, laughing and joking as they worked, already imagining how they would spend their shares in the brothels and taverns of Tortuga or Nassau. But when the taking was done and the galleon set afire to sink slowly in the deepening dusk, Rourke assembled his men on the main deck and announced the division. He would take half for himself, as was his right as captain. His 6 lieutenants would share another quarter among them. The remaining quarter would be divided among the 130 common sailors, barely 300 pieces of 8 per man after 7 months at sea and half a dozen successful raids. The silence that followed his pronouncement carried a weight of rage barely contained. Men glanced at one another, their eyes speaking what their mouths dared not. Rourke saw their discontent and smiled, a thin, cruel expression that never reached his remaining eye. He drew one of his flintlock pistols, already loaded and primed, and placed it on the rail before him. "Any man who disputes my division may speak now," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the deck in the tropical evening air. "I will hear all complaints with patience and consideration." No one spoke, no one moved. The crew stood frozen, their hands clenched into fists, their jaws tight with suppressed fury. After a long moment, Rourke replaced his pistol in his belt and dismissed them to their duties. But something had broken in that silence, some final thread of loyalty or fear or resignation that had kept the crew in check. As the men dispersed to their watches and their hammocks, Gareth Price caught the eye of Thomas Crowe, the ship's master gunner, and saw his own thoughts reflected there. Neither man spoke, but both understood. In the weeks that followed, the whispers grew louder and the conspirators more bold. Price became the reluctant center of a growing circle of malcontents who gathered in the forward hold during the night watches, when the Red Captain slept in his cabin and his loyalists kept watch elsewhere. They were 18 at first, then 25, then 40, nearly a third of the crew. Among them were men of all nations and backgrounds, English deserters from the Royal Navy, French Huguenots who had fled persecution, Dutch sailors displaced when their settlements in Brazil fell to the Portuguese, Irish Catholics who had chosen piracy over starvation, and even a handful of freed African slaves who had joined the account after Rourke raided a Portuguese slaver off the Bight of Benin. Thomas Crowe spoke for many when he growled, "We've given our blood and our loyalty, and what have we to show? Scars and poverty, while the Red Captain grows fat on our labour. In Port Royal I heard tell of Bartholomew Roberts, who treats his crew fair and splits the prize according to the old articles. Why should we serve a tyrant when free men sail these same waters?" "Because the tyrant will kill any man who challenges him," replied James Whitmore, the ship's carpenter, a cautious soul who nevertheless attended these midnight councils. "You've seen what becomes of those who displease him." Benjamin Fletcher questioned the captain's navigation and was given 30 lashes. Samuel Pierce took an extra ration of biscuit and was put in irons for a week. And we all remember what happened to Marcus Webb. They remembered, Webb had been the ship's quartermaster until he suggested, politely, reasonably, that the division of plunder should follow the traditional pirate code rather than Rourke's arbitrary decree. The Red Captain had shot him in the stomach with a pistol at point-blank range, and let him die slowly on the deck while the crew watched, forbidden to offer aid or comfort. It had taken Webb 4 hours to expire, and his screams had echoed in the nightmares of every man present. "Then we must be certain of success," Price said quietly. "If we move against him, we must be swift and absolute. Half measures will see us all hanging from the yardarm or worse. We need the majority of the crew behind us, and we need to act when his guard is lowest." "When is that?" asked Michael Reeves, a young sailor barely 20 years old who had watched his closest friend die under the lash 6 months prior. "The bastard sleeps with one eye open, well, his only eye, and his lieutenants are always watching." "Every man sleeps deepest just before dawn," Crow observed, "and even the Red Captain must eventually trust in his locked cabin door. His lieutenants keep watch in rotation, never all together. If we can secure the support of at least one of them, we can take the ship without a shot fired." The idea was audacious, but not impossible. Of Rourke's 6 lieutenants, one, a former Royal Navy midshipman named Edmund Blackwell, had shown occasional glimmers of conscience and had intervened more than once to reduce punishments from lethal to merely brutal. Blackwell was neither friend nor foe to the common sailors, but he was pragmatic, and Price believed he might be persuaded that his own survival depended on choosing the winning side when the moment came. They approached him carefully during a rare moment of privacy when he stood watch alone on the forecastle, the Crimson Judas anchored in a secluded cove off the southern coast of Cuba, while the crew took on fresh water and repaired storm damage to the rigging. Price climbed the steps slowly, making no effort to hide his approach, and stood at a respectful distance before speaking. "Mr. Blackwell," he began, his voice low but steady, "I would have a word with you concerning matters that affect us all." Blackwell turned, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his cutlass. He was a lean man of perhaps 30 years, educated and articulate, in a way uncommon among pirates, and his eyes held a wariness born of experience. "Speak plainly, Price, and be quick about it. If the captain sees us in conference, he'll suspect conspiracy." "He would be right to suspect," Price admitted. "There are those among the crew who believe the time has come for a change in command. I tell you this not to threaten, but to offer you a choice. Stand with us when the moment comes, or at least stand aside, but know that if you oppose us, you'll share the Red Captain's fate." Blackwell's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, calculation perhaps, or fear. "You speak of mutiny," he said softly. "A hanging offense under any flag, pirate or naval. What makes you think I won't inform the captain and see you all in irons by sunset?" "Because you're as tired of his cruelty as we are," Price replied. "You've saved men from the worst of his rage more than once, risking his displeasure to do so. That tells me you remember what it means to serve under honorable officers, and you know Matthias Rourke is not one of them. How many more men must die for his greed before even his lieutenants begin to wonder if their loyalty will be rewarded or if they too will eventually displease him?" The silence stretched between them, while the warm Caribbean wind rustled through the ship's rigging and the distant calls of tropical birds echoed from the jungle shore. Finally, Blackwell spoke. "If such a thing were to happen, and I make no promises, what would become of those who served him loyally?" "That would depend on their actions when the crisis comes," Price said carefully. "Those who defend the captain would face the consequences. Those who accept the new order would be given the chance to prove themselves under fairer articles, and those who assist the transition would be rewarded with positions of trust in the new command structure." Blackwell nodded slowly. "I will not aid you," he said at last, "but neither will I betray you. When the moment comes, I will be asleep in my cabin, and my pistols will be unloaded. What happens on deck will happen without my knowledge or involvement. That is the most I can offer." It was enough. Price extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Blackwell shook it, a brief, firm grip that sealed an unspoken pact. The boatswain returned to the conspirators with the news, and their planning intensified. They chose their moment carefully. The third night after the Crimson Judas departed the Cuban Cove and set course for Tortuga to resupply and offload their accumulated plunder. The weather was fair, the seas calm, and the crew's resentment had reached a fever pitch after Rourke ordered another flogging, 20 lashes for a sailor who had been caught sleeping on watch, a punishment that left the man's back a ruin of torn flesh and blood. The mutiny began at 4 bells in the middle watch, that darkest hour before dawn, when even the most vigilant sentries feel their eyelids grow heavy and their minds drift toward sleep. Price and Crow led a group of 20 armed men who moved with practiced silence through the ship, securing the armory, the powder magazine, and the cabin where Blackwell slept undisturbed. Another group under James Whitmore took control of the helm and restrained the watch officer, a brutal Londoner named Silas Root, who had been one of Rourke's most enthusiastic enforcers. Root struggled and managed to shout once before a belaying pin struck him unconscious. That single cry was enough. The Red Captain emerged from his cabin already armed, a brace of pistols in his belt and a cutlass in his hand, his remaining eye blazing with fury in the dim light of the stern lanterns. Behind him came 2 of his loyal lieutenants, roused by the commotion, and the narrow companionway erupted in violence. Rourke fired both pistols in rapid succession. The first ball took Michael Reeves in the throat and dropped him gurgling to the deck. The second missed Price by inches and splintered the mast behind him. Then the Red Captain was among them with his blade, and for a moment it seemed he might prevail through sheer ferocity alone. He cut down Thomas Crow with a slash that opened the gunner's belly, then parried a thrust from James Whitmore and riposted to drive his cutlass through the carpenter's shoulder. Men fell back before him, their resolve wavering in the face of the demon they had sought to overthrow. But Gareth Price had not come this far to fail. He seized a musket from a fallen comrade, brought it to his shoulder with the smooth efficiency of long practice, and fired. The lead ball struck Matthias Rourke in the chest, just above the heart, and the Red Captain staggered backward, his cutlass clattering to the deck. Blood spread across his rust-colored coat, soaking the fabric until it gleamed wetly in the lantern light. Rourke fell to his knees, one hand pressed to the wound, the other reaching for a third pistol tucked into his sash. Price dropped the musket and drew his own blade, closing the distance in 3 swift strides. Their eyes met for a single eternal moment, the boatswains filled with grim determination, the captains with hatred and defiance even in death. Then Price's cutlass rose and fell, and the Red Captain's reign ended in a spray of crimson that painted the deck and the faces of the watching men. The remaining loyal officers surrendered immediately when they saw their commander dead, and the mutineers in control of every vital point aboard the ship. The crew assembled on deck as the eastern horizon began to pale with the approach of dawn, and Gareth Price addressed them with Rourke's blood-stained cutlass still in his hand. He spoke of the tyranny they had endured, the comrades they had lost, and the new order that would govern the Crimson Judas henceforth. The ship's articles would be rewritten according to the traditional pirate code: equal shares for all hands, election of officers by democratic vote, and fair treatment under a rational discipline that punished genuine crimes rather than arbitrary displeasure. Most of the crew cheered and embraced the change, relieved to be free of Rourke's cruelty. A few remained silent, either mourning the dead captain or uncertain what this revolution would mean for their own positions. The 5 remaining lieutenants who had served Rourke were given a choice: swear to the new articles and accept reduced rank, or be put ashore at the next landfall with their personal possessions and enough provisions to reach civilization. 3 chose to stay, including Edmund Blackwell, who emerged from his cabin to find the ship transformed and quietly took his place among the common sailors without protest. 2 others opted for exile and were landed at a fishing village on the Hispaniola coast the following day. The body of Matthias Rourke was sewn into sailcloth weighted with cannonballs and committed to the deep according to the rough ceremony pirates used for their fallen. No prayers were spoken, no kind words offered. He sank into the Caribbean darkness and was gone, and with him went an era of brutality that the crew hoped never to see again. But before the corpse was consigned to the sea, Price removed one item from the dead captain's possessions, a brass-bound logbook in which Rourke had recorded every raid, every prize, every act of violence committed during his 7 years of command. The entries were written in a neat, educated hand that seemed grotesquely at odds with the atrocities they described. Price kept the log, intending to burn it once they reached port. But he found himself reading it during the long night watches, trying to understand how a man became such a monster. The early entries revealed that Rourke had once been different. A privateer operating under legitimate letters of marque from the English crown, striking only at enemy vessels during the Anglo-Dutch wars and dividing plunder fairly among his crew. But somewhere around the 3rd year the entries changed. Rourke began to obsess over betrayals, both real and imagined, convinced that his men were plotting against him, that officers were stealing from the common fund, that everyone around him was dishonest and unworthy of trust. The punishments grew harsher, the divisions of prize money more unequal, the contempt for his crew more explicit. By the 5th year, Matthias Rourke had ceased to be a privateer and become something far darker. A pirate captain who ruled through terror because he believed it was the only force that prevented chaos and betrayal. The log's final entry, written the night before the mutiny, read simply, "The crew grows restless. I feel their eyes upon me, judging, hating. Let them hate, so long as they fear. Fear is the only truth that endures upon these waters." Price closed the book and stared out at the moonlit sea, wondering if any man who chose this life could avoid Rourke's fate. The Crimson Judas reached Tortuga 3 days later, and word of the mutiny spread through the pirate haven like wildfire. Some applauded the crew's courage in overthrowing a tyrant. Others warned that such precedents endangered all captains and could lead to anarchy. The French governor of the island, himself a former buccaneer, listened to Price's account of events and ruled that the mutiny had been justified under the circumstances, particularly given Rourke's violation of the traditional pirate code. The accumulated plunder was divided according to the new articles, and for the first time in years, the crew of the Crimson Judas had coins in their pockets and hope in their hearts. Gareth Price was elected captain by unanimous vote, and he accepted the position with reluctance and a keen awareness of the responsibility it entailed. He renamed the ship the Liberator, and had the crimson ensign struck and replaced with a black flag bearing a white hourglass, a symbol reminding all who saw it that time ran out for tyrants and free men alike. Under his command, the ship operated successfully for another 4 years, taking prizes from Spanish and French merchantmen, but always treating captives with mercy and dividing spoils fairly. The crew remained loyal not from fear, but from genuine respect, and the knowledge that they sailed under a captain who valued their lives and their welfare. Edmund Blackwell eventually rose to become Price's quartermaster, his education and tactical skills proving invaluable in planning raids and navigating the complex political landscape of the Caribbean. The 2 men formed an unlikely friendship, bound by their shared memory of the night they helped end the Red Captain's reign of terror. They never spoke of it directly, but sometimes during calm evenings when the Liberator rode at anchor in some secluded cove, they would stand together at the rail and watch the sun set over waters that had drunk so much blood and treasure. In 1694, the Liberator was pursuing a Spanish treasure galleon through the Windward Passage when a sudden hurricane descended upon them with the terrifying speed common to those waters. The storm lasted 3 days and scattered both ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. When the winds finally subsided and the crew of the Liberator assessed their damage, they found themselves dismasted, taking on water through sprung planks and far from any friendly port. They jury-rigged repairs sufficient to limp toward the nearest land, a small uninhabited quay in the Bahamas chain where they could beach the ship for proper carpentry work. It was there, while careening the vessel to expose her damaged hull, that they discovered something peculiar. Hidden in a secret compartment beneath the captain's cabin, a space that had belonged to Matthias Rourke, was a locked iron chest that none of them had known existed. They broke it open with crowbars and found inside not gold or silver, but something far more unsettling, a collection of letters. Dozens of them, written in various hands and addressed to Rourke under his true name, which was not Matthias Rourke at all, but Jonathan Edward Pemberton. The letters revealed a story that none of the crew had suspected. Pemberton had been born to a wealthy merchant family in Bristol, educated at Cambridge, and commissioned as an officer in the Royal Navy at age 22. He had served with distinction during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, earning commendations for bravery and tactical skill. But during a raid on a Dutch settlement in the Caribbean, he had been captured and held prisoner for 8 months under conditions of extraordinary cruelty. The Dutch, seeking revenge for English atrocities committed during the sacking of their colonies, had subjected their prisoners to systematic torture and degradation. When Pemberton was finally exchanged and returned to English custody, he was a changed man, prone to violent rages, deeply paranoid, and convinced that mercy and compassion were weaknesses that led only to suffering and betrayal. The Royal Navy offered him a medical discharge, which he refused. Instead, he resigned his commission and disappeared into the shadowy world of privateering under the assumed name Matthias Rourke. The letters from his family in Bristol grew increasingly desperate over the years, begging him to return home, to seek help for his afflictions, to remember who he had been before the war destroyed him. The final letter, dated 1686, informed him that his father had died and left him a substantial inheritance, but that Jonathan Edward Pemberton had been declared legally dead and his estate distributed among other heirs. Gareth Price read these letters with a mixture of pity and horror, understanding at last that the monster they had killed had once been a man. A good man, perhaps, before violence and trauma twisted him into something unrecognizable. He showed the correspondence to Edmund Blackwell, and together they debated what to do with this knowledge. In the end, they decided to burn the letters and the logbook together, watching as the flames consumed both the evidence of Rourke's crimes and the explanation for them. Some stories, they agreed, were better left untold, but they kept the iron chest itself emptied of its secrets, and Price used it to store the new ship's articles and the democratically maintained account books that recorded every prize taken and every share distributed. It seemed fitting somehow that the instrument of Rourke's isolation should become the repository of the crew's collective governance, a symbol of transformation from tyranny to something approaching justice. The Liberator continued to sail under Price's command until 1698, when a Royal Navy squadron finally cornered them near Port Royal. Rather than fight against overwhelming odds, Price negotiated a surrender, The ship and its crew were taken into custody, and all hands were tried for piracy in the Vice Admiralty Court, established by the British Crown to deal with the plague of lawlessness in the Caribbean. The trial was brief and the verdict inevitable: guilty on all counts. 43 men, including Gareth Price and Edmund Blackwell, were sentenced to hang at Execution Dock. On the morning of their execution, a large crowd gathered along the Kingston waterfront to watch the pirates die. Price stood on the gallows platform with remarkable composure, addressing the assembly in a clear, strong voice that carried across the water. He spoke not of innocence, for he admitted freely to the crimes of piracy and robbery, but of the circumstances that had driven him and so many others to that life. He spoke of oppression and cruelty, of officers who treated common sailors as less than human, of economic systems that left men no choice between starvation and outlawry. And he spoke of Matthias Rourke, the Red Captain, and the lesson his life and death contained. "We killed a tyrant," Price said, his words recorded by a journalist present that day and later published in the colonial newspapers. "But we could not kill the tyranny that made him. As long as power corrupts and fear governs, there will always be another Red Captain, another crew that rises in mutiny, another cycle of violence that ends at the gallows or beneath the waves. We did what we thought necessary to survive, and perhaps we were right, and perhaps we were wrong. History will judge us, but history is written by those who wield the rope, not those who swing from it." The trapdoors opened, and 43 men dropped to their deaths while the crowd watched in silence. Their bodies were left hanging for 3 days as a warning to other pirates, then taken down and buried in unmarked graves outside the city walls. The Liberator was refitted and pressed into service as a Royal Navy patrol vessel, her new role bitterly ironic given her history. She served for another decade before running aground in a storm off the coast of Florida and breaking apart in the surf. Years passed, and the story of the Red Captain and his mutinous crew became legend among the sailors and pirates of the Caribbean. The details changed with each telling. Some versions portrayed Rourke as a devil incarnate, others as a misunderstood military genius, still others as a tragic figure destroyed by war and madness, but all the stories agreed on one point: that he had ruled by fear alone, and that fear had ultimately been his undoing. The tale was told in the taverns of Tortuga and Nassau, in the slave markets of Port Royal and Havana, wherever men gathered who made their living from the sea and understood the terrible allure of power and the price of challenging it. In 1724, a traveller visiting the ruins of an abandoned pirate camp on a nameless island in the Bahamas discovered something half buried in the sand near the remains of a cooking fire. It was a corroded iron chest, broken open by rust and time, its contents long since vanished. On the inside of the lid, scratched with the point of a knife, was a brief inscription in English. "Here lie the secrets of the Red Captain, burned and forgotten. Let his name be a warning and his fate a lesson. Fear cannot rule forever." The traveller, who was a merchant captain transporting goods between the colonies, copied the inscription into his journal and later shared it with a historian writing a chronicle of Caribbean piracy. The historian included the account in his work, which was published in London in 1728 under the title A General History of the Pirates. The chapter devoted to Matthias Rourke and the mutiny aboard the Crimson Judas became one of the most widely read sections of the book, fascinating readers with its themes of tyranny and rebellion, corruption and redemption, violence and justice. The author noted in his commentary that the story, whether entirely factual or partly embellished by legend, contained truths that resonated beyond its specific historical context. Power without accountability breeds cruelty. Cruelty breeds resentment. And resentment, given time and opportunity, breeds revolt. These were cycles as old as human civilization and as relevant in the courts of kings as in the holds of pirate ships. By the 1730s, the Golden Age of Piracy was drawing to a close. The Royal Navy and other European powers had established permanent squadrons in the Caribbean, specifically tasked with hunting down pirates and privateers. The major pirate havens like Nassau and Tortuga had been shut down or brought under governmental control. The era of the buccaneers, those freebooting mariners who had terrorized Spanish shipping and plundered colonial towns with near impunity, was ending. Men like Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Charles Vane, pirates who had achieved infamy during the final years of the Golden Age, were dead, captured, or retired. The Caribbean was becoming civilized, or at least pacified, and the wild freedom that had attracted so many desperate souls to its waters was being systematically eliminated. Yet the memory of that era persisted in songs and stories, in whispered tales told by old sailors to fascinated children, in the legends that accumulated around certain names and certain deeds. The Red Captain became one of those names, a symbol of tyranny and its inevitable downfall, his story repeated as both cautionary tale and romantic adventure depending on the teller's perspective. Some versions made Gareth Price into a hero, a liberator who freed his fellow sailors from oppression. Others portrayed him as a traitor and mutineer who received his just punishment at the gallows. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either extreme suggested. In the dusty archives of the Vice Admiralty Court in Kingston, the trial records of Price and his co-defendants gathered mold and slowly deteriorated over the decades. Few ever consulted them, and fewer still were interested in the nuanced reality they presented, a reality in which both victim and victimizer, both oppressor and oppressed, were deeply flawed human beings making desperate choices in desperate circumstances. It was easier and more satisfying to reduce the story to simple morality, to clear heroes and villains, to straightforward lessons about right and wrong. But morality on the sea has always been more complicated than morality on land, where laws are clear and enforcement consistent. The ocean recognizes no sovereignty, respects no authority, but the wind and waves. Men who lived upon it existed in a liminal space between civilization and chaos, between order and anarchy. They created their own laws, their own codes, their own systems of justice and punishment. And when those systems failed, when the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective survival tilted too far toward tyranny, violence became the only remaining method of correction. This was the world that produced Matthias Rourke and Gareth Price, the Red Captain and his executioner, bound together by circumstance and blood across the years. Neither was wholly innocent, neither wholly guilty. Both were products of their time and place, shaped by forces larger than themselves: war, poverty, the brutal logic of survival on the edge of empire, where European laws meant little, and strength was the only currency that mattered. They played their parts in a drama as old as seafaring itself, and when their particular act concluded, others stepped forward to continue the performance. The iron chest that had once held Jonathan Edward Pemberton's letters and Matthias Rourke's logbook, that corroded, empty vessel discovered on a nameless beach decades after the events it witnessed, eventually found its way into a private collection in London. The collector was a retired naval officer who had served in the Caribbean during the final campaigns against piracy, and he kept the chest as a curiosity, a memento of his service in those violent, romantic waters. He showed it to visitors occasionally, recounting the story as he had heard it from older sailors, embellishing certain details and omitting others according to his audience and mood. When the collector died in 1756, the chest was sold at auction along with the rest of his possessions. It passed through several hands over the following years, its provenance gradually forgotten, its connection to the Red Captain and his mutinous crew lost in the accumulation of time and distance. By the end of the 18th century, it was simply an old iron chest, unremarkable and valueless, stored in the attic of a country house in Surrey. Eventually it was discarded, or lost, or destroyed. The historical record is silent on its ultimate fate. But the story it represented survived, preserved in the pages of pirate histories and nautical memoirs, in folk tales and ballads sung in port taverns, in the collective memory of those who went to sea and understood the particular madness and clarity that the ocean imposed upon human affairs. The Red Captain ruled by fear, the story always began, and his crew turned on him, and blood was spilled upon the deck of the Crimson Judas one dawn in the year 1689. After that, the variations multiplied, but the core remained constant. Tyranny breeds rebellion, cruelty begets violence, and even upon the lawless sea, there exists a point beyond which men will not be pushed. Whether this knowledge constituted wisdom or merely observation was a question each teller and each listener had to answer for themselves. The sea offered no guidance, continuing its eternal rhythms regardless of human concerns. It swallowed ships and sailors, pirates and merchantmen, the innocent and the guilty without discrimination or judgment. In its depths lay the bones of Matthias Rourke and countless others like him, their stories reduced to fragments, their truths dissolved in salt water and time. Above, the Caribbean sun blazed down upon waters that had once been red with blood and plunder, but were now merely blue, indifferent, eternal. The iron chest, wherever it finally came to rest, held nothing but emptiness and the faint scratched words of men long dead. It had outlasted them all. The Red Captain, his mutinous crew, the ship they sailed, the era they represented. It remained as mute testimony to events that had mattered intensely to those involved, but meant little to the vast currents of history. Just another small drama played out on the world's great stage. Significant only to those who participated or witnessed it directly, fading with each generation until even the legends grew vague and unreliable. Still, in certain lights at certain times, when old sailors gathered to trade tales of the sea's golden age, someone would mention the Red Captain, and someone else would nod knowingly and add a detail or two, and the story would be told once more. Changed slightly from its previous telling, but recognizable nonetheless. Fear cannot rule forever, the story said. Even the cruelest tyrant must eventually sleep, must eventually trust, must eventually make the fatal error that gives his oppressed victims their chance. And when that moment comes, the reckoning is swift and absolute. This was the lesson, if lesson there was, in the tale of the Red Captain and his fall. Whether it was a lesson anyone heeded, whether it prevented even one act of tyranny or inspired even one act of rebellion, cannot be known. History moves in mysterious ways, shaped by forces both great and small, obvious and subtle. The mutiny aboard the Crimson Judas was merely one small thread in an immensely complex tapestry, visible only to those who looked closely at one particular corner of one particular era. But for those who did look, who did listen, who did remember, the story retained its power. The Caribbean would know many more pirates in the years following Rourke's death, many more mutinies and battles and executions. The cycle continued until the forces of civilization finally imposed their will and drove the last free rovers from the seas. But before that happened, before the age of piracy ended and became merely history, there were moments of terrible freedom and terrible consequence, of men who rejected all authority except their own and paid the price for that rejection. Matthias Rourke had been one such man, and Gareth Price another, and their confrontation exemplified the paradox at the heart of pirate existence. the desire for freedom from oppression that so often led to new forms of oppression, the quest for justice that could only be pursued through injustice, the longing for peace that required violence to achieve. The iron chest, empty and forgotten, resting somewhere in darkness or perhaps destroyed entirely, required no inscription beyond the one already carved upon its lid. Those words, "Here lie the secrets of the Red Captain," burned and forgotten, served as epitaph for an era as much as for an individual. The secrets of that violent romantic age of sail were many, and most had indeed been burned or forgotten, lost when the last participants died and took their memories with them. What remained were fragments and shadows, stories that might be true or might be invented, lessons that might be wisdom or might be fantasy. But the iron chest itself, that physical object that had witnessed and contained so much, endured in the only way material things can endure, by existing, by occupying space, by resisting dissolution slightly longer than the flesh and words and memories it had outlasted. And if someday it was rediscovered, if some future historian or archaeologist recognized its significance and traced its provenance back to the Crimson Judas and the events of 1689, perhaps the story would be told again with new details and new interpretations. Perhaps someone would read those scratched words on the inside of the lid and understand what they meant, what they represented, what they preserved. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the chest would remain lost, and the story would fade entirely, and the Red Captain would become nothing more than a footnote in obscure histories, one name among thousands who lived and died during piracy's golden age. Either way, the sea would continue, the Caribbean sun would blaze, and ships would sail those same waters where blood had once been spilled, and treasure hunted, and mutinies plotted in darkness. The ocean remembers nothing and forgets nothing, contains all stories and tells none. It simply is, unchanging in its essential nature despite the endless transformation of its surface.